There is a question that few ask honestly enough. Why did so many beings who had experienced genuine forms of spiritual development also experience forms of material scarcity, while beings who had not experienced such development had often accumulated resources in ways that the moral perspective would have expected were those who had experienced genuine spiritual development? Rudolf Steiner did not avoid this issue. He had investigated in the Akashic records what was happening in the economic and spiritual realm of the fifth cultural epoch, in ways that had revealed something about this apparent inversion that exceeded what any conventional moral or spiritual perspective had been able to adequately articulate. And what had been found had revealed that there had been a specific law, a law that had governed the relationship between what had been called Ahriman's forces in the economic field and what had resulted for the material path of beings who had undergone genuine spiritual development in ways that exceeded what the simplified law that good is always rewarded had been able to articulate. Steiner taught that Ahriman's forces had operated specifically in the economic field of the fifth cultural epoch in ways that corresponded to what he called the conquest of the economic field as one of the most effective fields of operation available in the present evolutionary moment. And the result of this operation included what was called the Ahrimanic law of attraction. The tendency that what was in the state at the service of Ahriman's forces had tended to find conditions in the economic field that had facilitated the accumulation of resources in ways that exceeded what had been found by those who had not been in the same service. Steiner investigated what was specific about the way Ahriman's forces operated in the economic field, and what was verifiable about how that operation created what he called the Ahrimanic advantages, in ways that explained something about the apparent reversal that he called one of the most uncomfortable questions that esoteric teaching had needed to answer honestly. The Ahrimanic advantages had resulted from what had happened when certain beings had operated in the economic field in ways that had corresponded to what Ahriman's forces had facilitated, had resulted in ways that had included what had been called cold, calculating economic thinking that had operated without the temperaments that had often worked against the accumulation of resources in pure and ruthless ways. Like the magnetic field that had attracted metal in ways that exceeded what any other agents had attracted without the magnetic nature. What Ahriman's forces had made available as an advantage had attracted what corresponded to that nature in ways that exceeded what the field, without this correspondence, had often achieved in the economic field. What if material success didn't start in the outside world, but in a silent transformation that happens inside you? Rudolf Steiner related the development of will, thought, and inner discipline to the way in which human beings act on their own lives. Maybe there's a reason some people hoard opportunities while still feeling like they're not moving forward. The real secret may not just be in how to achieve more, but who you become as you conquer. If you want to discover this esoteric perspective on success and inner development, the next step is in the description link or pinned comment. Steiner described what had been specific about the role of what he called field coolness as one of the instruments that Ahriman's forces had made available, and what had been verifiable about how field coolness had operated to economic advantage in ways that exceeded what the opposite quality had often achieved. The coldness of the field had corresponded to the state in which the being had operated in the economic field, in ways that had not included what they had called the temperaments of love, compassion, and consideration for what was happening to others in ways that had often worked against the forms of decision that the economic field had required for success, according to the laws that had of state governing the economic field within the conditions that the forces of Ahriman had created. And what resulted corresponded to what was called Ahrimanic effectiveness, the quality of effectiveness in the economic field. What had resulted from thinking without the temperaments of love and compassion in ways that had exceeded what thinking with these temperaments had often achieved within the specific conditions that Ahriman's forces had created in the economic field. Steiner investigated what had been the result for beings with genuine spiritual development in the economic field under these conditions, and what had been what he called the spiritual cost of adapting genuine development to the conditions that the forces of Ahriman had created in ways that exceeded what the purely pragmatic perspective had often articulated about the same cost. Beings with genuine spiritual development had gone through something that I had called the fundamental tension, the tension between what genuine development had called the quality of presence to the other and what was to happen, and what the conditions that the forces of Ahriman had created had called the forms of operation that material success had required within those conditions. And the tension had often resulted in forms of operation that had corresponded to compromises that had worked against the genuine development of forms that had created what had been called the spiritual cost of adaptation to Ahrimanic conditions. The cost that had not simply resulted in less development, but had resulted in forms of regression that had actively worked against what had been developed. Steiner had articulated that there had been a choice that beings with genuine spiritual development had to make in the economic field, and that the choice had not been simply between material success and spiritual development in ways that had opposed the two as exclusive alternatives. The choice had corresponded to what I had called the choice between success under Ahrimanic conditions and the path of finding forms of operation in the economic field that had not required adaptation to Ahrimanic conditions in ways that had worked against development. It had corresponded to the path of finding what I had called the genuine economic field. And the genuine economic field had corresponded to what had been called the forms of economic activity that had operated in ways that had corresponded to what the teaching had called the most suitable conditions, to forms that had included genuine service, genuine quality of work, and field integrity in ways that had exceeded what the forms of activity that had simply adopted Ahrimanic conditions had made available as a field of operation. Steiner investigated what had been the specific teaching about the forms of economic activity that had corresponded to the genuine economic field, and what had been what he called the conditions that that field had required in ways that had exceeded what conventional criteria of economic success had often been articulated. The genuine economic field had required what it had called association, the form of economic organization that had operated in ways that had corresponded to what it had called the principle of fraternity, in ways that had exceeded what forms of organization that had operated in purely competitive ways had provided as a field of operation. And the association had corresponded to what had been called the forms of economic activity in which those who had participated had pursued what had resulted in ways that had served what had been most suitable for the group of which they had been a part, in ways that exceeded what the forms of activity that had simply sought what had been most suitable for the isolated individual had often achieved as a field of operation. Steiner had articulated that the principle of fraternity was not simply a moral principle that needed to be adopted in ways that required the sacrifice of self-interest. It was a principle that corresponded to real laws that governed the genuine economic field in ways that investigation confirmed as verifiable, like the difference between going about an activity in ways that had corresponded to the nature of the activity and going about the same activity in ways that had not corresponded to its nature, in ways that had created resistances that had worked against what was to come. Fraternity had to correspond to the nature of the genuine economic field of form. RMs, that the operation without fraternity, had created resistance that had worked against what would have been the most consequential result. Steiner investigated what had been the role of what he called living economic thought, the form of thought about the economic field that had corresponded to what had been articulated about living thought, as thought that had operated in ways that had exceeded what thought, derived simply from sensory experience, had often achieved. Living economic thought had responded to what was called the perception of the real forces that had operated in the economic field in ways that the purely statistical and analytical perspective had rarely been able to perceive in such direct ways. It had corresponded to what had resulted when thought had perceived the economic field in ways that had included the superphysical dimension of what was happening in the state, in ways that exceeded what thought without such perception had often made available. And living economic thought had created the conditions for forms of economic activity that had served the genuine economic field in ways that exceeded what purely analytical economic thought had often achieved. It had created the conditions for forms of activity that had operated with the forces that had of state operating in the economic field in ways that had exceeded what operation without that insight had often provided. Steiner investigated what had been the teaching about the relationship between what he called the threefold social order and what had happened in the economic field, in ways that had revealed something about why the economic field had often worked against the spiritual development of beings who had undergone genuine development. The threefold social order had responded to what had been articulated about the need for the three domains of social life: the spiritual and cultural domain, the legal and political domain, and the economic domain, to operate in ways that corresponded to the principles most appropriate to each domain, in ways that exceeded what had resulted in when the three domains had operated in confusion, in ways that had created the distortions that history had recorded as the most undesirable results of confusion between the domains. If this channel has helped you explore Rudolf Steiner's teachings and see issues such as success, consciousness, and personal development from another angle, you can help this work continue. There are many hours of research, reading, study, and production behind each content. If you wish to make a donation to support the channel, it can be done via PayPal using the PayPal link in the pinned comment. Your contribution helps keep the project active and makes it possible to produce new content about Steiner, Anthroposophy, and inner development. And what had happened in the economic field of modern times had corresponded to what I had called the confusion between the domains, had corresponded to the state in which the economic domain had invaded the spiritual and cultural domain in ways that had created what I had called the commodification of the spiritual, in ways that had actively worked against genuine development, in ways that had exceeded what the perspective without an understanding of the threefold order had often been able to perceive in such complete ways. Steiner had articulated that the answer to what he called the apparent reversal, the success of beings without spiritual development and the dearth of beings with genuine development, was not the result of simply accepting the conditions that the forces of Ahriman had created in ways that included simply adapting to the same conditions. There was the result of following what had been called the path of the genuine economic field, the path of finding and creating the forms of economic activity that had operated in ways that had corresponded to what the teaching had called the most suitable conditions, in ways that exceeded what adaptation to Ahrimanic conditions would have achieved as a field of operation. Steiner concluded the teaching with the observation that he would capture what was most urgent and consequential in everything he had articulated about the esoteric truth of material success. The apparent reversal had resulted in the state's economic field operating within conditions that Ahriman's forces had created in ways that had facilitated accumulation for those who had operated under the rules, are Ahrimanic, and had made accumulation difficult for those who had operated according to the laws of genuine development. And the answer was not the result of adapting to Ahrimanic laws in ways that had worked against development. It was the result of finding and creating the forms of economic activity that had operated in ways that had corresponded to what the teaching had called the genuine economic field, in ways that exceeded what adaptation would achieve as the most consequential and most substantial course. This is Rudolf Steiner's teaching on the esoteric truth of material success that no one tells you, in its second version, which covers what the first had not achieved. The economic field as the most specific territory of operation of Ahriman's forces in the fifth cultural epoch. The Ahrimanic law of attraction explains the apparent inversion between the success of those without development and the scarcity of those with genuine development, the coolness of the field as an Ahrimanic advantage in the economic field, the fundamental tension between what genuine development calls for and what Ahrimanic conditions call for, the choice between success in Ahrimanic terms and the path of the genuine economic field, the principle of fraternity as what corresponds to the nature of the genuine economic field. Economic thinking lives as one that perceives the real forces operating in the field, the triple social order and the commodification of the spiritual as the most fundamental distortion that modern conditions have created, and the revelation that the most uncomfortable esoteric truth about material success is not that the spiritual and the material are opposed. It is that the forces operating in the modern economic field have been specifically shaped to hinder the success of those who pursue genuine development and to facilitate the success of those who operate according to the laws that the forces of Ahriman have made available as the most favorable conditions for accumulation within the economic field of the present evolutionary moment. Steiner deepened the teaching by investigating what was specific about what he called collective economic karma, the karma that resulted from what had been created in the economic field over centuries in ways that had created the conditions that the present had inherited as the economic field in which present beings needed to operate. Collective economic karma was not simply the result of historical errors that could simply be corrected in specific ways. It was the result of processes that had operated over centuries in ways that had created the configurations of the economic field that the present had inherited as the conditions in which it was operating. And these configurations had included what had been called the law of inversion of values. The law that had resulted from what had happened when the domains of the threefold social order had been confused in ways that had created the commodification of the spiritual and the politicization of the economic in ways that had worked against what each domain had called its most suitable conditions. Steiner had articulated that the law of inversion of values had corresponded to what had resulted when value had been determined by the economic field in ways that had corresponded to what the economic field had made available as criteria of value rather than being determined by the spiritual and cultural domain in ways that had corresponded to what the spiritual domain had made available as the most appropriate criteria. And the result had included what was called the devaluation of the genuinely valuable, the process by which what had been genuinely valuable from the point of view of human development had been progressively devalued within the economic conditions that Ahriman's forces had created in ways that the law of value inversion had confirmed as the most verifiable result of those conditions. Like the difference between the field in which value had been determined by criteria that had corresponded to what had genuinely served human development, and the field in which value had been determined by criteria that had corresponded to what had been made available as an economic return within the conditions that Ahriman's forces had created. The law of inversion of values had resulted from the confusion between the two fields of value determination. Steiner investigated what had been the teaching about how the human being who had undergone genuine spiritual development could operate within the inherited economic field in ways that served development without simply having adapted to Ahrimanic conditions that had worked against development. The response had included what was called the recognition of real conditions, the honest recognition that the conditions of the present economic field had created specific resistances to the genuinely developing being in ways that exceeded what theories of simple spiritual alignment had often articulated. And it had also included what was called the work of creating alternative conditions, the work of finding and creating the forms of economic activity that would operate within the present economic field in ways that would correspond to what the teaching had called the genuine economic field in ways that exceeded what simple adaptation to existing conditions had made available. Steiner had articulated that the work of creating alternative conditions had corresponded to what he called the most fundamental cultural work of the present evolutionary moment. It had corresponded to the work of creating within the present economic field the conditions that had served the development in ways that exceeded what was available simply as inherited conditions, like the farmer who had needed to work the soil in ways that had created the conditions for what was to be cultivated before cultivation could take place in ways that had served development. The work of creating the alternative conditions had needed to take place before the genuine economic field could operate in ways that had served development with the fullness that the teaching had called for. Steiner investigated what had been the role of what he called economic medicine, the understanding of the processes of disease and health in the economic field in ways that had exceeded what the purely analytical perspective had been able to articulate about the same field. Economic medicine had corresponded to what I had called the perception of the forces of disease in the economic field, the perception of what was happening in the economic field in ways that had corresponded to what I had called the processes of disease in ways that the perspective without esoteric understanding had rarely been able to perceive in such direct ways. And the forces of disease in the economic field had included both what I had called the luciferic diseases, the forms of economic activity that had resulted in uncontrolled enthusiasm in ways that had created the speculative bubbles and crises that had followed, and what I had called the Ahrimanic diseases, the forms of economic activity that had resulted in hardening in ways that had created the crystallization that had worked against the flow that the economic field had needed. Steiner had articulated that economic medicine had responded to what he called the work of creating balance, the state of the economic field in which luciferic and Ahrimanic forces had been held in balance in ways that had created the healthy economic field, that human development had needed as the most suitable conditions of operation. And the work of creating balance had corresponded to what had been called economic work from the teaching of the threefold social order, the work of creating the conditions in which each domain had operated in ways that had corresponded to what had been called its most adequate conditions, in ways that exceeded what had resulted when the domains had operated in confusion, in ways that had created the distortions that history had recorded. Steiner investigated the role of what he had called the gift economy, the form of economic activity that had operated in ways that had corresponded to what he had called the principle that what had exceeded what the being had needed to exist could be made available to the field as a contribution that had served the development of what had been called the state, in ways that exceeded what the accumulation of that surplus had often achieved as a field of operation. The gift economy had not simply corresponded to charity, it had corresponded to the principle of what had been called spiritual work in the economic field, the recognition that what had exceeded what had needed to exist had corresponded to a force that could be made available to what had been called state, in forms that had exceeded what accumulation had made available. And he also lived up to what he had called the recognition of the superphysical origin of capabilities, the recognition that what had been possible to create in ways that had exceeded what had needed to exist had been the result of development that had simply exceeded what the effort of the individual being had achieved, in ways that had created the understanding that there had been something beyond individual effort that had contributed to what had been possible to create. Steiner investigated what had been the role of what he called economic rhythm perception, the ability to perceive the rhythms that had operated in the economic field in ways that corresponded to what he called the rhythms of the evolutionary process, in ways that exceeded what the purely analytical perspective had been able to perceive about those same rhythms. The economic rhythms had corresponded to something that I had called the supraphysical rhythms, the rhythms that had operated in the supraphysical fields in ways that had corresponded to what was happening in the evolutionary process, in ways that the purely economic perspective had rarely been able to perceive in such direct ways. You can work more, study more, seek new opportunities, and still feel like there is something blocking your progress. But what if the problem wasn't just external circumstances? Rudolf Steiner placed great importance on the conscious development of will and the ability to transform thoughts into actions. Perhaps material success is, in part, a reflection of what you have learned to do with your own inner strengths. If you want to understand this connection, continue through the link in the description or the pinned comment. And the perception of superphysical rhythms had served work in the genuine economic field in ways that exceeded what operation without such perception had often made available. It had served in ways that had made it progressively more possible to operate in correspondence with what was happening in the state, in ways that exceeded what operation simply reactive to the rhythms of the inherited economic field had achieved. Steiner concluded with the observation that the teaching would be definitively complete in its second version. The most uncomfortable esoteric truth about material success was not the result of what was called spiritual fatalism. It was not the result of the conclusion that spiritual development had determined the scarcity of forms that could not be changed. It was the result of an honest understanding that the economic field of the present had operated within conditions that the forces of Ahriman had created in ways that had facilitated the success of those who had operated according to Ahrimanic laws, and had created specific resistances for those who had operated according to the laws of genuine development. And it was also the result of the realization that the response to those conditions was not the result of adapting to them in ways that had worked against development. It was the result of the work of finding and creating the genuine economic field in ways that had been operating in accordance with what the teaching had called the conditions best suited to genuine development, in ways that exceeded what inherited conditions had made available. The apparent inversion existed. Esoteric truth revealed why it existed. And Rudolf Steiner's teaching about the esoteric truth of material success that no one tells him about was the teaching about the forces that had created the inversion and about the way to traverse the economic field in ways that had served genuine development without adapting to the conditions that had actively worked against what development had always called the state, the most fundamental achievement that incarnated life had always made available. This is Rudolf Steiner's teaching on the esoteric truth of material success that no one tells him about. In its second version, complete and articulated with the honesty and precision that always distinguished the genuine esoteric teaching from any form of spirituality that had sought the same result without the courage to articulate what was genuinely happening in the economic field of the present evolutionary moment in ways that incomparably exceeded what any purely optimistic perspective on the relationship between development and spiritual and material success had always been able to perceive adequately. Steiner addressed the final dimension that was to make the teaching completely complete, which was specific to what he called the role of the ego as the most fundamental force there was. What had resulted in the economic field was determined by the being who had undergone genuine spiritual development in ways that exceeded what the purely material perspective had been able to articulate about the same result. The ego had not simply corresponded to the self in the ordinary psychological sense. It had corresponded to what had been called the genuine self, what had been more deeply of the being in ways that had corresponded to the progressive development of the sovereignty of the self over what had been called the lower limbs. And what resulted from the development of the genuine ego included what was called creative perception, the ability to perceive what state needed to be created in ways that exceeded what perception reactive to existing conditions had often provided as a field of creative perception. Steiner had articulated that creative perception had been the most fundamental capacity for work in the genuine economic field. It had been fundamental because it had corresponded to what the state had been called the most specific contribution of each being to the genuine economic field in ways that exceeded what simple participation in existing economic structures had made available as a field of contribution. Like the difference between the worker who had participated in existing structures in ways that had corresponded to what the structures had called for, and the worker who had perceived what was state in need of being created in ways that had exceeded what existing structures had provided, in ways that had created something that had exceeded what was state present before creation. Creative perception had corresponded to the latter in ways that perspective without the development of the genuine ego had rarely provided in such direct ways. Steiner investigated what had been the role of what he called the attention economy, the law that had governed how the quality of attention that had been given to what had been done in the economic field had influenced what had resulted in ways that exceeded what the quantity of effort had often been made available as a factor of influence over what had resulted. The economy of attention had resulted from the law that what had received the quality of attention that corresponded to genuine development had tended to develop in ways that exceeded what had received attention without that quality, had resulted in ways that had revealed that the quality of what had been made available as attention had been as determining as the quantity of effort in ways that the purely quantitative perspective on success had rarely articulated. And the attention economy had served the genuine economic field in specific ways. It had served in ways that had made it progressively more possible that what had received the quality of attention that had corresponded to genuine development had developed in ways that exceeded what had received attention without that quality within the conditions of the present economic field. Steiner investigated what had been the role of what he called the genuine rhythm of work, the quality of rhythm in the field of work that had resulted from the development of qualities of sovereignty over what he had called the ordinary rhythms of work that had often corresponded to what Ahrimanic conditions had created as the prevailing rhythms. The rhythm of genuine work had corresponded to what had resulted when the being had developed sovereignty over how it went through what had been covered in the field of work, in ways that had corresponded to what had been called the rhythm that had served the development of what was state to be created in ways that exceeded what the rhythm reactive to existing conditions had often made available. And it had served the genuine economic field in ways that exceeded what rhythm without that sovereignty had often achieved. It had served in ways that had created something in the field of work that had corresponded to what I had called the quality of presence, to what had been done in ways that had influenced what had resulted, in ways that exceeded what simply reactive rhythm had often provided. Steiner investigated the outcome of everything he had articulated about the esoteric truth of material success in terms of what he called the concrete practice most immediately accessible to the contemporary human being who wanted to travel the genuine economic field within the conditions of the inherited economic field. The practice had corresponded to what had been called work with the quality of creation, the practice of going through what had been done in the economic field in ways that had included the question of what state needed to be created in ways that went beyond what had simply to participate in existing structures in reactive ways, and it had also corresponded to what had been called self-paced work, the practice of progressively developing sovereignty over how one had traversed what had been traversed in ways that had corresponded to the rhythm that had served the development of what was to be created in ways that exceeded what the reactive rhythm had often made available. Steiner concluded with the definitive observation that the teaching on the esoteric truth of material success was to make the teaching on the esoteric truth of material success completely complete in its second version. The truth was not the result that the spiritual and the material were opposed. It was the result that the economic field of the present had operated within specific conditions that had created specific resistances to genuine development and facilitated the success of those who had operated under the laws that those conditions had facilitated. And the answer was not the result of resentment toward those conditions, nor of adapting to them in ways that had worked against development. It was the result of the honest work of understanding the conditions, of finding and creating the genuine economic field within those conditions, and of navigating what were state to be called forms that had served genuine development in ways that exceeded what any adaptation to Ahrimanic conditions would achieve as the course of greatest substance and of greatest consequence. The genuine economic field existed as a possibility. It was the field that Rudolf Steiner had described with the precision that was always distinguishing the genuine esoteric teaching from any form of positive thought about the relationship between the spiritual and the material that had not articulated what was genuinely happening in the forces that had operated in the economic field of the present evolutionary moment in ways that incomparably exceeded what any purely optimistic or purely pessimistic perspective had been able to perceive, in ways so complete and of greater consequence for the most fundamental development that incarnate life had to offer. This is Rudolf Steiner's teaching on the esoteric truth of material success that no one tells you, in its second, definitively complete version. Steiner had articulated this teaching with the honest clarity of one who had recognized that the most uncomfortable question about material success and spiritual development had needed an answer that went beyond what forms of spirituality that had simply promised that the spiritual attracted the material had often made available as an answer to that question, which had always merited the honesty and precision that only genuine esoteric investigation had always been able to provide to the human being who had arrived with the willingness to hear what was to come. Been genuinely true about what was always happening in the economic field as the field of operation of forces that incomparably exceeded what any purely material or purely optimistic perspective had ever been able to perceive. The issue deserved this honesty, and Rudolf Steiner had given the honesty it deserved. He had revealed what was always happening in the state, in ways that direct investigation into the Akashic records had confirmed as what had genuinely governed the relationship between spiritual development and material success, in ways that incomparably exceeded what any form of positive thinking or market spirituality had ever managed to articulate on the same topic, in ways that had corresponded to what was genuinely happening in the economic field of the present moment evolution of human consciousness. Perhaps the biggest mistake is thinking that the outside world can change, while you remain exactly the same inside. Rudolf Steiner's perspective begins elsewhere. Thought, will, and consciousness. When these forces are worked on consciously, the relationship with work, goals, and choices can change profoundly. And maybe that's why the real secret to material success isn't a formula for getting rich, but a transformation that of the person who seeks this success. If this reflection made sense to you, the additional content is in the description link and in the pinned comment.